So, Ted, you have had a long and productive life, and Amherst has been a very important part of that life. And I'd just like to take you back to when you started as a student at Amherst College. Would that be 1941? 1941?
That would be June of 1942,
Okay. All
a
right.
long time ago.
Okay.
At the time, the country was at war. I had enlisted in the Navy.
Why the Navy, Ted?
Well, to avoid the Army.
Okay.
I would have been drafted in the Army, but enlisting in what was called the Navy V-12 program, which was to train you to be an officer. And the assumption was automatically that if you were going to Amherst College, or its Ivy League equivalent,
Yes.
you were thereby qualified to be a Navy officer, which was a silly assumption, but nevertheless, that was the rule at the time.
Well, we did win the war.
We did ultimately, despite having Ted Cross mess up a few times. Anyway, in June, Mother drove me up. And it was amazing at that time. Mothers always seemed to take their boys into Amherst College. A lot of mothers were there that day. And Mother came. She fixed curtains for me. I had a little tiny room in Pratt Hall, Pratt dorm. I guess there's a new Pratt now, but this is the old Pratt. So we arrived there and looked around. And the amazing thing was that this was in the middle of the Depression. The country had not yet recovered from that horrible experience, but there was enormous wealth. These kids came with valuable leather furniture, and God knows, we didn't call them stereos then. They were various record players, but I mean, some kids brought thousands of dollars worth of stuff. And I had rather inferior furniture, but we got along. Anyway, what impressed me was I'd come from Deerfield Academy, and the arrangement there with Amherst was really quite unusual. Normally, you apply to Amherst College, and they decide whether they want you or not. At Deerfield Academy, the headmaster, whose name was Frank Boyden,
Yes.
would call up and say to Dean Wilson, "I'm sending you 18 boys this year." And so it was kind of a reverse form of admissions. Anyway, there were a huge number of kids. All the kids at Amherst that time, not all, but a huge percentage came from prep schools. Unlike Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, where you were admitted basically on pedigree.
Yes, but I think even at that time, a large fraction came from prep school. Certainly at
Yes,
Yale,
but
that was
a
true.
different type of, the prep schools tended to be from the Midwest, I think.
Yes.
And I don't remember any Groton kids. And I don't remember pedigree being a qualification for admission, as it was at Princeton and at Harvard at that time. So at Amherst, you could easily be admitted to Amherst if you paid the tuition of, what was it, $350, I think? $350.
A little less than Harvard. When I asked Elting Morrison why he went to Harvard, he said, "I went to Harvard because my father had $1,000.
Good reason. So at Amherst, that was the tuition, and probably a C+ average almost anywhere was sufficient. Amherst was not a selective school. Terrific, high prestige school, but it was not selective. Anyway, that was the situation at the time. There were no working class kids, what you call blue collar kids. I never met a kid there whose father was a member of a labor union. I don't even recall it, anything like that. There were a handful of black kids, not many, not as many, obviously, as there are today. One of the things that I remember at the time, which seems very odd, every Sunday, the president had a brunch. And I think initially all the freshmen were invited, but the black kids weren't. Now at the time...
This is 1942.
42.
Yes.
At the time, there was nothing unusual about this. the idea of segregation was firmly, not discrimination. Amherst did not discriminate, but segregation was firmly in place. And it never occurred to anybody that there was anything wrong with that. But looking back on it now, it was an extraordinary arrangement. And also, Amherst used to sponsor school dances. And the black kids could go only if they brought a Smith girl, if they could find a Smith girl, a colored Smith girl,
Yes.
to go with them. So that was the rule of race at that time. And as I say, no, it never occurred to anybody that there was anything wrong or unusual about arrangement of that sort. I worked at Valentine Hall because I was on scholarship. I think 30 cents an hour. But you've got to put yourself back at that time, and that probably wasn't too bad. So we worked. What else did we do? The war was on, so the Amherst boys made their contribution to the war effort. We dug potatoes out in
In Hadley there?
Hadley, I guess it would have been. So that was the cultural description of Amherst at that time. In terms of academics, I remember taking a course in it was some form of advanced mathematics, maybe not too far advanced, but the amazing thing, I was really lousy at it, but if you got your paper in on time, you got extra points.
I see.
So you could get 105
yes,
just by turning your paper in time, which was an extraordinary arrangement at a college. Of course, the great course there at the time was English 1.
English 1, who taught that, Ted?
Everybody, all these great people. Ted Baird, Reuben Brower, Armour Craig, a couple of others, and they were terrific. And it was a wonderful, wonderful course. And you had to write a paper every day. Every blasted day.
Yes.
And that's 5 days a week.
Yes.
And the subjects were extremely difficult.
Yes.
For example, describe how you hit a baseball. Now, very few people can write a decent paper on that subject. They can write a good paper on Freud,
Yes.
but how do you actually hit a baseball?
Yes.
And so it was very challenging. And looking back on it, I think it was one of the finest, most valuable courses that I ever had. And it's a shame that it's, as far as I know, it's not required today.
No, unfortunately not.
And I know that kids coming into Princeton, where I live, many of them are, these kids are bright as hell, but they can't construct a decent paragraph.
Yes.
And many of them have to take sort of a affirmative action course in writing. So that's what the first year amounted to. Stanley King was president,
Yes.
a very stiff and austere kind of a guy. He was president, I think, for 15, 18 years.
Oh, my. Very long
longer,
tenure.
maybe longer.
Very long.
Longer. Not particularly popular, but he did a good job, and but everybody was terrified of him. So that's what those are kind of the memories I have of the first year there.
So there was the first year, but then there was this war going on. When did you go off to the Navy?
I actually was in the Navy, I think, we did one semester at Amherst, and then I have, as I mentioned, this V-12 program,
Yes.
where I was actually in the Navy, where you were still not in uniform, but you were in and not being paid. And that was a preparatory years for ultimate officer's degree.
Right.
But the odd thing was the whole group of V-12 students at Amherst were sent to Williams College.
Oh,
And everybody was,
for
because they had...
inferior training. Yes.
No, I would think it meant, actually the faculty at Williams is unbelievably good, right? You have to concede that. And so I spent a year at Williams in the V-12 program, and it was a marvelous education there. But I was still in the Navy, and then of course we went off to war.
Yes.
But
And which theater were you in, Ted? You were in
the Pacific.
In the Pacific.
Yeah.
I see. Now you actually rose to be pilot of a craft. You were commander of a craft, actually.
Well, that was after the war ended. What happened was some of these poor guys that were running these ships had been out there for 3, 4, 5 years.
Yes.
And so the Navy had to get them home right away.
Yes.
For political reasons, you know,
Oh, all
be
right.
held
Yeah.
to pay.
Bring the boys home.
Bring the
Yes.
boys home. So they put incompetent people like me in charge of these ships. And it was really ridiculous.
Where did you
because
pick
the-
up? Where did you
well,
pick
the
up
crew
your-
were
your
competent.
group?
The crew were competent.
Okay.
But the officers were a total disaster.
But they were well-educated gentlemen.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, my final orders were to take the ship from Ulithi, which is an island, a huge atoll south of Tokyo,
Oh, I see.
and where we've been all sent there in preparation for what was to be an invasion of Japan.
Yes.
And of course, the bomb came. The invasion was canceled. The war was over, and the ship. I got instructions. I was commanding officer at 18 or 19, and there were 5 other officers with me, but they were commissioned months after I, so I was senior, therefore more competent. It was sort of like the U.S. Senate. Seniority is what counts.
Something must have worked, Ted. You're here.
Anyway, so off I got orders to go to Portland, Oregon, and I sailed, and I was doing all the navigation. We didn't have any electronics at that time.
So you plotted the course with
I
maps?
working with a sextant.
And a sextant, yes.
With a sextant, and it was, oh good God, it was weeks and weeks, and never saw another ship. And finally, I hit it right on the nose.
Where did you go? Where did you
To
land?
Portland, to Oswego, Oregon.
Yeah.
And it was a remarkable achievement. And the crew cheered the first time they'd ever cheered anything I'd done in my life. And the horrible thing then happened. They didn't give me a pilot to take the ship in. I ran aground, but it was on sort of marshy land.
Yes.
And we backed off, and everything was okay. So, but looking back on it, that's really probably the most important achievement of my life.
Well, you left college a
to-
boy and you
to-
came back a
to-
man.
I know, absolutely. To go
absolutely.
5,000 miles
Yeah.
and navigate all the way. So
Yeah.
that was pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. So Amherst must have seemed like kind of a piece of cake when you got back.
Well,
after
the
an
amazing
experience like that.
thing was that people don't understand. The first thing we had to face was fraternity rushing.
Yes.
And you know, all the silly business
Yes.
of beanie caps and special uniforms and bowing to seniors
Yes.
and going through all these silly rituals. And these kids that had come back like me had seen death.
Yes.
I don't know, I'd seen a young sailor without a head.
Yes.
And a lot of these boys had been in Normandy and in the Italian campaign, and to come back and do that silly stuff.
So how did they
But
take
it was
to
it was very important because at Amherst College at that time, if you weren't in a fraternity, you were a social outcast.
Yes.
And so it was important, and so we put up with it. But I think at first time it focused my attention, and certainly I think the attention of a lot of kids, on the absolute absurdity
Yes.
of the fraternity system
Yes.
and its rituals,
Yes.
its hazing and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, but Amherst was the same. You know, Ted Baird was there.
Yes.
Reuben Brower was there. Lawrence Packard was there. You wouldn't remember him.
No,
but,
I didn't know him.
Dwight Salmon, all the great stars of the Amherst faculty were solidly in place, and the Amherst education went forward. Then those years were very happy years. But it was a very odd situation after having been through the war,
Yes.
of having all this fraternity business.
Yes.
The most dramatic change that occurred at Amherst at that time was, as I mentioned earlier, Amherst was a school for kids of privilege.
Yes.
And there were, in 1942, there were no blue-collar kids.
Yes.
But what happened was the GI Bill,
GI Bill
had
after the war.
intervened, and suddenly Amherst had kids from Lowell, Massachusetts, you know, despicable
The
places
factory.
like that, and from very, very working-class communities. So Amherst was transformed temporarily with a huge influx
Yes.
of kids who didn't have to pay tuition, because under the GI Bill, tuition was free. And I think we also got a check of $100 a month,
Yes.
and it was a terrific deal.
It was
So
a revolution in American higher education.
that's right,
Yes.
but it was imposed by the government.
Yes.
It wasn't one that is now being sought by the administration
Yes.
as a sort of a voluntary matter.
Yes.
So that was the big change, I think, in the college at the time. The strength of the departments, everything was solidly in place, as I mentioned
Yes.
before.
Yes. And so then you graduated from Amherst and went off to Harvard, like so many of our graduates still do.
Well, the
and-
reason there was, of course, you go to graduate school because the government's paying,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
Right.
what else you going to do in life? Anything to avoid taking a job. So hundreds of us went off to law school, and there again, Harvard was easy entry, very easy.
Really?
You know, right now, admission to Harvard Law School is a very,
It's
very
tough.
unusual achievement. But in those days, huge numbers of us went from Amherst. And so that was followed 3 years of law school.
Yes. And I won't let you get off so easily with that, Ted. You didn't just go to Harvard Law School, but you were on Law Review for 2 years, and you were actually editor of the Law Review for 2 years. So you must have done a fair amount of work there, actually.
I was a grind. I always was a grind, working hard. Even at Amherst, instead of going to football games, I spent time in the library.
Yes.
So I worked hard. If you work hard, you know, you can achieve that. Yes, so I was at the Law Review, on the Law Review, and that was, well, my mom and dad were very proud of that,
Yes.
and so am I.
Yes. And again, like so many of our graduates, you went to law school or business school or graduate school or whatever, and then went off into life and became a raging success. And we sort of, at Amherst College, we ask our raging successes to come back and be members of the board of directors. And you've been a member of the board for a very, very long time, the board of trustees for Amherst College. What's the function of the board of trustees? What's their charge?
Well, theoretically, the board does two important things: raise money. The faculty at Amherst really view that as the essential function, is raising money, I think. And then there's a secondary function of governance, which really means not to run the place, but to make sure that some flagrant error is not being made. And you know, then the trustees may not be particularly good at that, but in theory there is kind of a Supreme Court supervisory rule where they would act in that manner. So, but at Amherst it was a little different in that we were broken up into committees, and in many cases the committees had operating authority.
Yes.
For example, the Buildings and Grounds Committee would actually make decisions. Normally at most institutions, they would simply be there
Yes.
reporting, knowing very little, but purporting to keep the college from making a serious error.
Yes.
Amherst was different in that many of the trustees had hands-on responsibilities. So that was the, but I think the faculty said, look, you raise the money and our salaries are paid and they're okay, and that's all they view. And
Well, Ted, let's discuss this business of raising money a bit if we can, because, I mean, one of the great strengths that Amherst has is its financial independence and the great financial resources it has. It lets the college do a lot of things that are very important. And actually, you served, I think, as chair of the investment committee for a number of years at Amherst. And I've talked to a lot of people around Amherst who give you great credit for the extraordinarily fine financial condition the college found itself move into during that period of time. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences as
Amherst
chair of the investment?
It was very strange. You remember the history of Amherst?
Yeah.
In 1850, 50% of the graduates of Amherst went into the ministry.
I see.
And so there was a kind of a culture,
The percentage is a bit lower
penurious-
now, Ted.
penurious culture that infected the place for many, many years.
Yeah.
And it wormed its way into the investment policy. And Amherst's money, when I arrived, not when I arrived, but in a few years before I arrived, was invested in treasury bills. Very, very conservative. And the result is that the endowment performance was very weak. You know, it was like the equivalent of putting your money in the savings bank.
Yes.
So at that time, it was decided that there had to be a radical change. Other institutions were investing in securities and real estate and doing these marvelous things
Yes.
that were prudent but different.
Yes.
And so what happened was that Kurt Hertzfeld, who was treasurer for many, many years, and I and a few members of the board concocted an arrangement under which the endowment would go almost entirely in securities, what we call value instruments. That is, value companies with lots of inherent value, with gold in the ground or oil in the ground or very solid resources. And we happened to hit it very lucky at that time. There was a firm named, I forget, let's see, the name of the firm was, I can't think of it at the moment. But anyway, there was a firm that specialized in that kind of endowment.
Yes.
And we gave them most of the money, and they did very well. And it turned out, because of that particular decision, which was lucky in many ways, although I don't think Kurt would view that.
Most of the people I talked to didn't view it as primarily luck.
But anyway, it turned out that Amherst performed better than the 20 largest colleges in the country into the 1980s.
Yes.
So the endowment did rise to a really solid amount.
Yeah.
But in 1974, or maybe a little later, the endowment of the college was only $70 million. And you know, now it's $2 billion.
Yes. Yes.
And at the time, that caused a bit of a panic, really, in the board. And they did some extraordinary things. There was actually a debate on possibly selling the Lord Jeff.
Oh, my.
You know, not that Lord Jeff would bring any money. I don't know who would pay a cent for it, but I believe the college is now going to spend $20 million enlarging it. What?
Very much overdue.
I mean, but
Yes.
my God, at the time, I mean, you don't sell the Lord Jeff because Lord Jeff is an icon. It's a very important part of the college.
Yes.
But and another thing they did, which I think was a big mistake, they got rid of the Folger Shakespeare Theater, and on the theory that it cost too much money to run. And actually, I remember arguing at the time that the cost was tiny compared to the advantage that brought
Yes.
to Washington, D.C.,
Yes.
especially to the minority kids there.
Yes.
So, but there was a period in the 70s when the endowment was low, and the faculty was worried, and the trustees were worried, and there was some thought of cutting back, maybe on expenses. But as you know, Amherst always goes first class,
Yes, it does.
and ultimately it went first class,
Yes.
no
Yes.
matter what, and the endowment rose, and we did okay.
Yes. Yes. Well, you served on the board for really quite a long time. In fact, you're still a member of the board, Ted. And you've done a lot of things as a board member, but I think you did something rather controversial back in 1980 when you gave a significant gift to the college to endow a chair for a black professor in science. Could you tell us that story? Why did you do it, and what are some of the things that happened as a consequence of it?
Well, there was a strange attitude at Amherst that black people really were not qualified to teach white kids, and that there was no black in the country, black person, who had sufficient qualifications to teach a very complex subject, say in particle physics or something of that nature. And even though faculty hold themselves out as very liberal and open, often they've got a very inherent bias and prejudice about their own profession.
Yes.
And that kind of made me angry. Now, at the time, I'd sold my business, my publishing business, so I had some money. And so I said, well, to hell with this. This is nonsense. And I gave the college $1 million, which, now $1 million is nothing. But it was sufficient to establish a chair. And one of the qualifications or requirements of the chair was that the first appointee, only the first appointee, had to be an African-American person. And amazingly, hell broke loose. There were major stories in the New York Times that this was a form of just reverse discrimination, absolutely improper for any institution that chooses people on merit to do anything of this nature. There were members of the faculty of Amherst that were very upset. We had a very solid legal opinion that this would stand up constitutionally, and we were felt okay about that. But there was a lot of controversy, and ultimately that went away. But it worked, and the choice was extremely successful. Everybody was pleased. But the holder of the chair now, I forget who holds the chair now.
Bob Hilburn.
Bob Hilburn.
Bob Hilburn.
Obviously, he's not
No,
African
not
American.
black.
So it was kind of a strange thing to do at the time, but it was kind of a chink. It was kind of a first step in affirmative action. And it was a very moderate, I think it withstood ultimate criticism or serious criticism because it was moderate in the sense the first person. If you tried to establish a chair in perpetuity,
Yes.
it wouldn't work.
Yes.
It just wouldn't work.
Yes. Yes. Very true.
So that was the story there.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, it was okay.
Yes. One of the applicants for that position was Shirley Jackson, who didn't take the position. But Shirley Jackson, of course, had an illustrious career first with Bell Labs, and then she became president at Rensselaer, where she's done extremely well.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I
I
think
didn't
one
know
of the
that.
one of the opinions at the time you created that chair was that there wouldn't be any black applicants who would be able to take on such a job.
Well, that was the attitude at Amherst, and it was the attitude of people who simply weren't informed,
Yes.
and because they lived in this little cocoon of Amherst College, and the way searches operate into who do you know, who are the good people, and so forth, and so it was that attitude was universal, and it was Amherst, and it was racist.
Yes. Of course, things have changed a great deal at Amherst College now. The searches are totally open. We try and include as many different groups as possible, and it's really a major turnaround, a major change.
Absolutely.
Ted, but everything doesn't always work out well, and sometimes mistakes are made. You sat on the board for a long time. Did you ever come across a situation where maybe you thought the board was making a mistake? Maybe not doing quite the right thing, not making quite the right judgment?
I mentioned getting rid of the Folger Theater was a stupid thing to do. I mean, the cost wasn't great. That was an error. It wasn't a catastrophic error that did damage to the college. But the theater was a wonderful gem. It decorated the college too, and it performed a very important social and educational function in the District of Columbia. So I certainly, and the other would be English 1, to eliminate the requirement for English 1. And I'm not sure when that happened. I would consider that a major mistake. But that's an academic error. But I think if the trustees had said, look, you guys, this is a mistake, maybe the faculty would have backed off. And I think, too, the issue of curricular reform. Amherst's strength, when I went there, was based on really a great man named Alexander Meiklejohn,
Oh, yes.
who was president of Amherst College during the war, in the World War I years.
Yes.
He was an extraordinary man. He brought Niels Bohr to Amherst and people of that consequence, and admired everywhere. Probably one of the important First Amendment scholars in the country at that time. And my sense is that he produced a curriculum at Amherst that other great institutions emulated. I think even Harvard looked to Amherst English department, to guys like Baird and people who went before him. And so it seemed to me that if another mistake that might have been made, even though it may not have been a trustee error, was that the faculty have never really attacked this issue of curriculum reform. And it would be very exciting if someday what Meiklejohn did for Amherst in those years, many, many years ago, if that could happen again, and people would say, holy smoke, if you want a model of excellence, have a look at Amherst College.
Well, we are the best college. I guess the question
Yes,
is, do we
but I
still
meant-
give the best education?
Yeah, well, see, I didn't.
And if you compare your Amherst education with the education we're giving now, could you give us a frank comparison of how you view the education you got at Amherst College with the education you see being given now?
I really couldn't make a fair judgment on that. I know there's a lot of criticism of the college.
How about an unfair judgment?
Or, well, no, I would. The one comment I would make, the great quality in the English department was this guy, Ted Baird, who was an old rascal, and he was scary as the dickens. But he uses the Socratic method to teach. He never told the students the answers. He always drew it out, even if it, I remember on King Lear, we'd spent 3 weeks on King Lear every day. When one paragraph, what does it mean? What's this guy saying? And it was a brilliant way of teaching. And a couple of months ago, I went to one class. There's a wonderful professor there. I guess he's head of the English department. His name is Chickering, Howell Chickering. Do you know him?
Know of him?
And I sat in that class and I said, holy smoke, he's using, in many ways, with elaboration, the same technique that Baird used in 1942. So that's good. In other words, maybe some people would say that's traditional, but it was certainly impressive. And I thought the way he worked the class, it was a small class of 19 students, I think, and he used that same technique of withdrawing in a kind and gentle way of drawing out the answer. So that would be one example of what's happening up there, but I can't say that that's universally. The goodness that I saw there is universal at the college, because I don't know.
Well,
I
another
don't know.
difference-
Amherst's reputation is great,
It certainly is.
and probably as great as it was in 1942. Its leadership has been strong, and there's been certain other aspects of the college which definitely have contributed to it and to improve it. I was reading an article the other day. A plumber comes into your house,
Yes.
and you look at him, and he's dressed, and he's got a dirty old shirt, and he's got a Boston's Red Sox hat on, and he's got wearing it backwards, and he's going to fix he's going to fix something very important to you, right?
Yes.
Now, how many people can talk to that guy? Know how to
Yes.
engage him in a conversation, some sort of a preliminary
Yes.
conversation
Yes.
Before he engages in doing something very important.
Yes.
Now, it seemed to me that if you were if you went to Groton and Yale in the old days, you would have absolutely no preparation for that. There was no one in the class. There was no one in your class who would possibly be from that background, and so it wouldn't. And I thought of it in terms of John Kerry.
Yes.
He was a mess because he could not talk to people who were the basic contingency that he needed for election. And so what has happened there at Amherst now, originally at Amherst, when there were no, when everybody there was, most people there were privileged, you have never met any kids. Now, in my case, I was in the Navy for 2 years.
Yes.
That saves you.
Yes.
You
yes.
really learn the world, and you learn to talk to people.
Yes, you had better.
Right,
Yes.
but if I hadn't been in the Navy, God knows. I don't know if I could talk to that plumber who came in the other day. So what has happened at Amherst now, we have a much more diverse
Well, I'd like to ask
student
you about
body.
that, Ted. What do you think about Amherst's plans for diversification, not just
Well,
racial
there's a problem.
diversification, but
There's a basic
economic
problem.
diversification?
Originally, the idea was that it was a black problem. And the affirmative action was originally directed at Amherst, as it was elsewhere, aimed at ghetto kids.
Yes.
Kids who really would have to struggle to make the grade at Amherst. Now, if you go to Harvard, 90% of the black kids there are sons of doctors, engineers, dentists, academics. And I noticed the other day a story that Harvard is now tuition free for any family earning less, I think, $70,000, $80,000 bucks. I don't know what the figure is, it doesn't matter. But one of the faculty members commented, or asked the admissions department, how many black kids at Harvard would that make a difference? Would it make a difference for any of them? No, they're all above the 70,000. They're 70,000 figure. So that what has happened was, we're doing affirmative action on skin color.
Yes.
But what the elite schools are is bringing in black kids of privilege.
Yes. Yes. And
Now,
so,
I think what an important thing is what's going on now. Tony Marks is addressing that in terms of income. There's a major effort underway now, which I think in the country, which I think Tony is leading. At least he's getting a lot of the heat for doing it.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of criticism from alumni. And a lot of people say that he's lowering academic standards by reaching out to low-income kids whose SATs will be lower on the whole, on average. If you take the mean
be.
score of a kid from a family, have nothing to do with skin color,
yes.
from a lower-income family, the chances are the SATs will be lower.
Yes.
Not that the SATs are necessarily biased, but that's the way it is.
Yes.
And so the criticism of the Amherst plan, and I like to think of it as an Amherst plan because I think Tony's been leading it, and others are following. One of the major criticisms is the alumni think, well, this is bringing in kids who are not qualified to be at Amherst. And
There's some people who do say that, yes.
a lot of alumni, and who also see that maybe they're taking the places of their children and grandchildren
Yes.
who are not being admitted with higher SATs
Yes.
and who are able to pay full tuition.
Yes.
So it's a matter of criticism, but I think what Amherst is doing is addressing that flaw that we now have, that affirmative action is benefiting medium to upper income blacks.
Yes. Yes, it is. Yeah.
And now, I don't know, you see the students at Amherst, would you say that's true there too?
That's my general perception, but Ted, many of us know that when it comes to educational statistics about blacks and about economic levels, you're one of the world's experts on this. You publish a journal that is an authoritative version of statistical surveys of matters like this. Maybe you would talk to us a little bit about whether or not it wouldn't be possible to get kids from the lowest economic quartile who academically will be able to compete very well at Amherst.
Yes, absolutely. The point that's being made, the mean SAT
Yes.
of a white kid at the University of Michigan who comes from a lower, what we call low-income family,
Yes.
is going to be lower on average.
Yes.
Now, there may be kids with 800 perfect SATs, but you bet otherwise. In other words,
All
if
right,
you're betting on income.
But why should Amherst be
Now,
picking the average student?
What happens is, okay, there are probably, take any high school in Detroit, there are probably a dozen kids with near perfect SATs, black or white,
Yeah.
from low-income families. But the competition then is Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Amherst is competing with some very powerful institutions. So they are there, but the problem is, how does Amherst capture them? How does Amherst get those kids? And so they are no threat to the mean SAT at Amherst whatsoever. They've got terrific scores. They're bright as hell. They don't even need to take a cram course. They know the SAT from the day they were born.
Yeah.
So
You're describing kids like Robert McNamara.
you're right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and you know what happened to him.
Well, a number of things.
So I think the problem is they are there. Those kids are there, but everybody's focused on them. Berkeley,
Right.
Texas,
Yes.
Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Duke.
Yes.
You know, the senator from Boston, Senator Kennedy, he doesn't have his brain surgery at Harvard. He has it at Duke. Right? The world has changed.
Yes.
And they're terrific institutions.
Yes.
So I think the problem is that Tony's absolutely right. There's no diminution or damage to the SAT in embarking on this program, which brings in some terrific kids that you otherwise wouldn't see at Amherst.
If we look hard enough, can't we find
But you've
them?
got to send people out there. You've got to recruit. And also, people say, well, what is Amherst? You know, they know Harvard, they know Yale, they know Princeton. But when you say Amherst College, it doesn't have that clout that the big boys have. So, but I think Tony's on the right track. There have been negative stories, and there's been some commentary from alumni. But I think everybody's settled down, and the SATs at Amherst, average SATs are perfectly solid. So it's working. And but going back to what I said about the plumber coming in, as you sit and watch Amherst College kids graduate, it is so totally different from what it was.
The average
When
name is no longer Smith.
Or I used to sit there at graduation with the program, and I'd count the number of kids from the elite SATs, and you know, it was the Darians and the ones outside of Chicago and so forth. And for many years it didn't change, but then all of a sudden it changed. And even though there's a very solid representation of wealthy kids from Darien, Connecticut, still in the totality of the picture, the demographics of the student body at Amherst is very different from what it used to be. And that means that a kid who doesn't know how to talk to a plumber might learn a little bit how to talk to a kid from a different economic scale than his own.
Yeah, very, very
Terrific. So. Diversity is a wonderful, you know, the arguments for diversity are, to me, they don't often make the right arguments. To me, this is one of the great arguments. Going back to the one thing that was important, I think, you wonder what the trustees do,
Yes.
and that's coeducation. I'd like to just say a few words about that.
Yes.
For many years, there was tremendous opposition to coeducation everywhere.
Yes.
And of course, the alumni just couldn't see it. Dear old Amherst.
The women would be taking alumni seats.
Also, how can you have a party? Invite girls in from Smith, send them home, but they're actually going to classroom with you, and so forth. Their opposition was enormous. So the trustees heard the issue. This was in Bill Ward's his presidency, which I look back on as one of the strongest presidencies on this issue alone.
I've often heard you speak of Bill Ward and his presidency. Could you tell us just a little bit about him
Well, the
and what
best
happened
thing
during
of Bill
his
was
presidency?
he was called a sort of a truck driver academic, a really tough guy,
Yeah.
but a great scholar, came from Princeton, and very strong ethical issues and moral issues. But he took on this issue of coeducation, and he brought it up year after year. Every year, the trustees voted it down
Yes.
for reasons, even though Harvard and Yale and everybody else had moved in that direction.
Yeah.
The only laggard was Princeton, which was very late in doing it. So finally, and he was angry because the faculty weren't with him.
Yes.
Many of them were, there were many with him, but there were many who were in the closet, who were not making the case against it. And, there were issues. There was Mount Holyoke there was Smith College there. There were arguments for a single-sex male college, not good ones in my view, but there were arguments. But Bill finally, I guess I may have mentioned this to you, wrote a brief against coeducation. It was a brilliant piece of work.
No, I haven't seen
No,
that.
because
but,
Bill was terribly interested in process.
Yes.
That sometimes the process by which something happens is better than the result, or betters the result
Yes.
if the process is proper.
Yeah.
So that he wrote a marvelous, I wish it were in the archive somewhere. He wrote a terrific brief against something he dearly wanted to happen. And I said, holy smoke, this is a really remarkable guy who would do this. Well, he did that, and that still didn't work. Then he had one more weapon. He brought in someone from the English department. I don't know who it was. I don't think it was Baird. It was one of the stars of the English department to explain to the trustees why it was impossible to teach King Lear in an all-male classroom. That the vital part of it was the relationship of a father to his girls,
Yes.
his children.
Yes.
And the commentary would be so much broader, so much more interesting, and why the teaching process of King Lear would be much better if we could have women in the classroom. And then someone else he brought in to teach the same thing with Joyce, James Joyce. How Molly Bloom, an understanding of Molly Bloom, would be much better if there were women in the classroom. And the trustees suddenly said, well, you hadn't thought of that. And they voted coeducation.
So an intellectual argument. An
Wasn't
educational
just
argument, right?
wasn't just a general statement that diversity is good as an education for the educational process. He brought in two examples which the trustees understood, and they voted it. So, and of course, Bill's life was sad. Marriage was troubled. He was drinking too much. I saw him, I think, a week before he committed suicide. But you look back on presidencies, the strong presidencies are often ones, not where you raise money or that you did a good job, but where there was a crisis. There was an important issue which transformed the college forever.
Yes. Yes.
And I think you can say that. I see with Pouncey too, During Pouncey's years, there was a dramatic change in the diversity of the student body, and I think to some extent the faculty.
Yes.
And that's happening now, a similar trend with modifications because of the problems I mentioned of affirmative action is now happening with Tony Marks. So you look back on presidencies, and the good ones or the strong ones or the ones that'll be remembered are often ones where you just didn't do a good job of managing. You know, as I look back, during some of the presidencies of Amherst, the only thing that happened is that maybe 20 trees fell down at the Alpha Phi House. Nothing happened at all.
Yes.
So that would be my comment on presidencies.
Yeah.
And I think we've got very strong leadership now, but I cannot comment on the difference in the quality of education then in 1942 as now, except that Chickering example
Right.
is, to me, comforting.
Right.
That things are pretty much the same.
Were there maybe some other differences, though, in your experience, Ted? In other words, coming in as a student in 1941 or even 1947, 46, would you have chosen all of your own courses, or would you have had assigned courses? Would the college have dictated to you what you would
I don't remember. I guess I don't remember what the requirements were in 42. What are they open now? Or is there any?
We have an open curriculum now, yes.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think with young kids, they've got to be taught. They've got to take. Certainly, they've got to take a course in science. I know a kid who went through Amherst without taking a single course in science. How do you do that? It should be illegal.
It is not. Yeah.
It should be illegal, in my view. I don't care what it is. It is wrong not to have some exposure to science, and maybe a language other than your own. There certainly should be some requirements, and I don't know if Amherst had them or, see, I don't remember whether, I think probably we chose our own stuff. Except I remember having to take a course in astronomy, which I took simply because it was an easy grade. Now, was it required?
I don't know.
Would astronomy have met the test?
It would certainly be a science course, yes. Yes.
But everybody took it because it was easy. And you could get a sure A. So I think probably for the young kids, for a kid 18 years old that comes into Amherst College, there ought to be a requirement in science, and I think another language in your own. And some in the humanities, obviously, you will take anyway, and basic English, as I mentioned, English 1.
Should the trustees have anything to say about this?
Yes, I don't know why the faculty resisted a lot of these things, but I think there comes a point where the argument is so strong. And I think the argument for English 1 is so strong throughout the nation that maybe the trustees should say, look, we ordinarily do not interfere with the academic process, but this is wrong. And we can't force it on you. We cannot, the trustees cannot force it, but we can use a lot of sanctions and a lot of other initiatives to get that, to see that it's accomplished.
Yes.
But I don't want to leave the impression that there's anything, that I know of anything wrong there today, because what I've seen there is very positive and very nostalgic in some ways.
Yes. Ted, you've had a lot to do with making the college's endowment an enviable one around the country. And a lot of people have noticed that institutions like Amherst and Harvard and Princeton have very large endowments. State legislatures, even some federal legislatures, are beginning to feel like maybe what they would like to do is help the colleges spend some of that money. What are your views on that?
Well, of course, that's a very delicate issue, but let's take Harvard with an endowment of $35 billion. I don't know, is it equivalent to the whole value of Sweden? I don't know, it's a big figure.
Big figure.
Huge. And I think many people have demonstrated, good mathematicians have demonstrated, take all of Harvard's costs, all its depreciation, all its faculty costs, they really wouldn't have to charge tuition. you know, a 15% return on an endowment of $30 billion is what, 7 billion a year?
$4.5 billion a year?
Yeah, all right,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
Now, it's not always 15%, it may drop to 10, but it's always 10. So it's $3.5 billion. And how much is that a day? I don't know. It's a huge amount of money. And so mathematically, it's baloney when they say, oh, we need the money. Even to do what they want to do across the river, you know, at Harvard.
At Alston, yes.
Alston. It can be done. They can always raise money for it. Harvard, when Princeton goes into its fundraising mode, they take in $1 million a day. They don't even do anything. You know, it's like Barack Obama. You know, the money just roars in for some reason, for good reason. Anyway, so the guys in the Congress who say, look, most foundations have to spend 5%, and why should the great endowments be different? Now, take Oberlin College, which struggles.
Yes.
And actually mirrors Amherst in many ways, or what Amherst used to be, because Oberlin always sent more kids to PhD programs than anybody.
Oh, really? Wasn't aware of that.
Right, yeah,
Yes.
Amherst, you know, because a lot of the parents were high school teachers and stuff.
Yes, yes.
And Amherst, I think, competes very well that way. You know, they're not all going to work for Goldman Sachs. There are a lot
No,
of
some are going to work for Morgan Stanley, that's true.
and some of them maybe are going to get PhDs in comparative literature.
Yeah.
So to apply that rule to Oberlin would be insane, because Oberlin's endowment is so small. They barely struggle.
Yeah.
But when you have Harvard, Yale, and Princeton with endowments that are equal to the gross national product of Europe, I'm exaggerating, obviously,
Yes.
but the figure is so huge that, yes, I think it wouldn't be unsound to say, look, you've got your draw from endowment should be higher. For
So
many
you don't-
years it was 2%,
I see.
you know, and
Yes.
it could be higher.
Yes.
And of course, the colleges are fighting it now by eliminating tuition for low-income kids
Yes.
and for all those benefits and so
Yes.
forth, which is great and which is progress. But it seems to me there reaches a point that why do you need any more money? Some of these places, why? Because what you become is a mutual fund. Right? A mutual fund that does education also. But
So you think some of these legislators actually have a case?
yeah, and they're reasonable.
And you're making it for
These are
them.
not radicals that are
Yes.
arguing for this, and I'm not saying punish them. I'm saying, well, look, make them subject to the same rules as other foundations, 5%.
Ted, you're a surprising guy, and that's, I threw that question at you knowing what you would say, knowing you would say they have no right to do this, there are all kinds of qualifications that go with much of this money, they are crazy, and you said 180 degrees opposite of what I thought you would. And you do that all the time, and you're in a lot of different things.
Well, I believe in freedom. It's so important to have these institutions free from any legislative
Yeah.
control or influence. That would be a disaster.
Yeah.
But a modest rule, a 5% rule, to me, is insane, and it isn't punitive, and would make sense. But the problem is, it has to be limited to certain places, because Oberlin isn't Harvard,
Yes. Yes.
and Amherst isn't Harvard.
No.
I'm talking about money.
Yeah, I understand. Of course, when you consider the numbers of students,
Well, still, I mean,
a lot of
if
money
you
for
take
these
if you take the endowment of Princeton and divide it by the students, it's something like $1.5 million per student. Is the endowment. Amherst would be down maybe 800,000. So it's up there, but Harvard is unique.
Yes.
Well, no, Yale's pretty good too.
Yes.
Princeton is enormously wealthy.
Oh, yes, yes. Ted, why should a student get a liberal arts education as opposed to an education at a good institution like MIT or place like that?
Well, there's two
What-
parts of that. First of all, you get a terrific liberal arts education at MIT,
Now.
right?
Now you do, yes.
MIT is not a trade school.
Not anymore. Yeah.
I think the comparison should be why pursue a liberal arts education as opposed to learning how to do something? Why not just go to law school, or why not go to business school and so forth? So I think the answer there is, well, first of all, Amherst, one thing I would say about Amherst is I think Amherst still has a tremendous emphasis on the humanities, on teaching kids how to think,
Yes.
rather than teaching kids how to get a good job. You know, the careerism, you know that word, careerism, that's infiltrated many, many schools. I think in Princeton they teach a course on investment banking. Now that has no place. I may be wrong about that, but there's pressures all the time. Well, look, we're paying a tuition now of $50,000. Why don't we learn something useful?
Yeah.
And there is that problem. So, but the basic answer to your question is that, in my view, take a guy who wants to be a lawyer, or a woman who wants to be a lawyer, and ultimately maybe a judge, and compare, say, someone like Clarence Thomas
Yes.
to a Cardozo. Now, the difference is one has a very broad humanities background, knows things, read things, understood that some of their issues way beyond what we call stare decisis, that is, the rule of law. Clarence Thomas is a bureaucrat. He doesn't have that vision. He was well trained at Yale, didn't do very well at Yale, but he was well trained at Yale. But he doesn't have the vision that would go with being successful in any profession. Now, I think probably in medicine, certainly in academics, and in law, you're a much better lawyer if you've had 4 years of intense training in the humanities, and than you would otherwise be. So, and your life is bigger and better. You think about your thoughts
Yes.
if you've had a humanistic background.
Yes. Yes.
You say, what am I thinking? There was we ought to finish up here pretty soon, but one thing I think I'd like to make.
Yes.
There's a new president of Princeton who's a wonderful, wonderful person. She just received
Shirley Tillman.
She just received an honorary degree from Amherst. And she gave the most brilliant address at the Princeton graduation this year. And it revolved around a guy named Goheen, who was president of Princeton for many, many years. And her story was that she built around his life what a Princeton education does for a child. How you come in with biases, you come in with prejudices, you come in knowing things that ain't true. Or is Rumsfeld with things that aren't knowable? What did he say? Something silly. You remember Rumsfeld's famous.
He said a
famous
lot of
line.
silly things recently.
Yeah. Anyway, I had lunch with him the other day. It was really interesting. Anyway, she made the point was, here's Goheen, I think at age 38, was plucked out of the classics department at Princeton and made head of this great university.
Yeah.
And Princeton then was a place that took dumb kids from the South. And really, Princeton was not what it is today. Anyway, he was to transform the place and make it into the greatness as it is today.
Yes.
And she pointed out that he came across the question of coeducation, and he was against it. Then he thought about it for a while, saw how it was going in other places, and he changed his mind. Then he saw the question of Princeton was way behind on the admission of blacks, way behind. I mean, it went into the early 50s. It was really bad. But he was an old timer, and he said, well, let's keep Princeton the way it is. And then he thought about it, and ultimately he changed his mind. And so Shirley Tillman's point was that diversity and humanities education in the classics or whatever makes it possible for kids to change their mind, to create conflicting ideas, to see that there's other points of view. And that the most important function of a college is to do that. So that I go back to being a judge or a lawyer. You've got to have the ability to change your mind. The facts change. Rumsfeld should have changed his mind. He didn't. Right?
Neither did McNamara.
Yet he went to Princeton.
Yeah, he was like McNamara. It was very
He
difficult
didn't.
for him to change his
The
mind.
difference
Yeah.
is McNamara's a beaten man today. Rumsfeld isn't. So he didn't. Now there'll be instances where you don't change your mind when confronted with facts that contradict your opinion, your preconceived opinion. But this was a marvelous talk. I'll send a copy to you because she just made the point so well about how one of Princeton's greatest presidents came in with biases against women, against blacks, and changed his mind. And that is what the classics, a humanistic education, does for you. And I think that's the argument why there should be an Amherst College and why you shouldn't go to trade school if you want to be a lawyer. So,
Well, you're kind of a poster child for this sort of education, Ted. And if we're wrapping things up, I'm not going to let you wrap things up without turning to something totally different. And that is, you've done rather well at the professions, and there's more than one you've chosen. But I think you could have made a decent living as a photographer. I brought to this
no
interview
way.
this wonderful book of yours. In fact, I brought 3 of your books. But let's take a look at something called Birds of the Sea, Shore, and Tundra. And could we show just one of the pictures from this? Could we show this particular one? Isn't that gorgeous?
yeah, that's a skimmer.
It's absolutely incredible.
And
How did you
they're
ever
around
get that
Well,
picture?
if you live in New Jersey, you'll see lots of skimmers. You don't have to travel to see a skimmer.
But how do you get a
If you
picture
come
of
to,
them doing
you come to
that?
Princeton
Yeah.
in August, I'll take you to see a skimmer.
Great.
And that's the way they fly.
Wow.
And their lower bill is longer, you notice?
Yes.
The mandible is longer.
Yes.
Because they hit a fish, and these are like a flying pair of pliers.
Yes. Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah.
And they touch a fish, and it's a goner.
It's amazing.
So but this is the streak they leave behind.
Yes.
But you are never going to make a living at doing things like this. Now, if Audubon had kept alive from a couple
working,
hundred, and we were just talking about the one at Amherst, the
Yes.
first folio, what do you call it? The elephant folio. Each print in there is worth $500,000.
Good Lord. Yeah. The
And so
family
what
should
is
have held
happening
on
is
to them.
people are tearing it apart
Yes.
and selling the prints.
Yes. You mentioned some of the interesting presidents at Amherst.
He
You
came
mentioned
in.
King. How
He
about
came
Charlie
in
Cole?
just the second time for me. In other words, I think he came in '46.
Yeah.
Will, would that be right? I think 46, and he was such a gentleman, and everything. Amherst was perfect in those days. The only point I'm making is nothing happened in Charlie Cole's. So, and that's what makes presidencies interesting, right? But you have co-education or fraternities, But that was Armour Craig's. Remember,
Yes.
Armour Craig got that lousy job.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But apartheid was a big issue too,
Yes.
and
The investment in South Africa. Yes.
and I remember so well. The students were in the early '80s. The students were. You weren't there. No, you missed a lot of that, didn't you?
I was there for some of it. Yes.
You were?
Yes.
Well, the Amherst Endowment was doing so wonderfully. We were outperforming everybody. The place was unbelievably rich, and everybody was proud and fat. But I remember one of the graduations, all the students had armbands. And they either came wearing shorts
Yeah.
in opposition, or they had their gowns with armbands. And in opposition apartheid, in that the purpose was that the college should not own any security, that any business in South Africa whatsoever. So you remember at all the annual graduations, the trustees march
Yes.
through the students.
Yes.
Well, I remember marching one of those years, and all the students would say, "Hey, Ted, how are profits? How are profits?" And it's a long march.
It
right
is
to
a
the
long,
podium.
winding march, yeah.
And
right.
so the students were up. They got their way. You remember? I don't know if you remember what happened. Amherst.
Was there divestiture?
Yeah. You know, an interesting thing on divestiture now is there are arguments now that colleges should not own any securities in any of the Middle Eastern countries that are so oppressive. You say anything related to Saudi Arabia. So
Yes.
now it means under the law, say, of Saudi Arabia, what do you call the law of the Muslim?
Sharia law?
Sharia law. Under the Sharia law, you can't own a bank stock. Brilliant. What has happened was they couldn't own any bank stocks, and the bank stocks have collapsed, so that they've done very well because of their ancient law. So with Amherst, we had to sell all the drug companies, and I think we lost money on divesting.
Yes.
But that was a huge issue with the students.
Oh, my. Yes.
And it wasn't a serious problem, but and of course there was a lot of disagreement on the board, and that was certainly a big issue at the time.
Yes.
But again, in turn, going back to college presidencies, Bill Ward's presidency will go down in the annals for the simple reason that he brought coeducation to the college.
Yes.
A brilliant move against the opposition,
Yes.
and wrote the brief against it.
Well.
Brilliant.
Yes.
And that's memorable.
Yes.
So
Well, a good lawyer or a good philosopher should be able to argue both sides.
that's right.
Yeah.
Make the case so the process is better. So that, but Amherst has been very, Charlie Cole, he was a dream of a president. Everybody adored him. But there was no issue
No
at that
great
time.
crisis he had to
There
deal
was no
with.
great crisis
Yes,
that he
yes.
had to deal with. Goheen at Princeton had
Yes.
crisis after crisis, dealt with them brilliantly,
Yes.
and he's now, people say, well, this is the man that made modern Princeton.
Yes. Yes.
And it takes 100 years before you're going to know,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
who were the greats. John is clear. I think
Very
John
yes, yes.
probably,
He's-
despite his horrible problems, remember he borrowed money from the trustees at the end?
Oh, he
Remember
did?
the story? Oh, Ted Baird has written terrific stuff on this, or wrote great stuff on this. I don't know what kind of, he was gambling, or whether he had girlfriends, or what he had, but he would, every trustees meeting, he would panhandle the members of the board, and they'd all lend him money. But meanwhile, he was bringing Niels Bohr to the college,
Yes, right.
and putting
McLeish,
Amherst on the
yeah,
map.
Absolutely. My. Those
And
are
it's
not the
happening
stories
to-
about Meiklejohn you read in the anthologies, Ted.
Well, you know, Amherst College won't talk about those things. You know, it's like the University of Pennsylvania will tell you how many of their graduates have made $20 million,
Yes.
$200 million, but they won't tell you how many of them are in prison.
Quite so, yeah.
And you know, if you do your homework,
Yes.
you'll find a few of them are in prison.
You got-
And Amherst, another story that I always was amazed at. In 1820, there was a guy named Henry Lyman. Does that name mean anything to you?
No.
Will, do you remember that name? He was a missionary, a kid missionary, graduate of Amherst. And they sent him to Borneo.
Yes.
And he met up with some tribe. They promptly dismembered his body and ate all the parts.
Oh, my.
You know, I never knew this had happened to any Amherst graduate. Well, we had missionaries and we sent them all to these terrible places. But
Well,
those stories are not told.
We think of ourselves as nourishing the world intellectually, but certainly not corporally. Well, Ted, I think you know that the analysis of citations, it's very important for academic work, it's important for promotions, it's important for scholarly research. And some years ago, you owned a company, the Institute for Scientific Information, that pioneered some very important methods in citation analysis. Could you tell us a bit about that company and about that particular approach?
Yes, the best way to understand this company, I think you must understand what it does before I tell you the history.
Yeah.
Suppose a biologist or a science person at Amherst College has a suspicion, without evidence, that there's some sort of a link, genetic or otherwise, between Lou Gehrig's disease and childhood measles.
Yeah.
You know, just a wild idea, a suspicion. And often great ideas often just happen that way. Now, there's no way for him to really pursue that, except there is one route that was developed by the Institute for Scientific Information, and that is by doing a computer research, a keyword research. Now, what is possible now is that professor could ask a computer in Philadelphia, give me every single science paper ever published or published in the last 20 years that mentioned Lou Gehrig's disease, and then you'd use the technical word for it, which I don't remember, ALS, AL something or other. Anyway, I want every paper that mentioned Lou Gehrig's disease and measles use those words within 4 words of each other, or 5 words. And I'd also like to know whether they were ever mentioned in the same paper, at any point in the same paper. Now, if that had happened, there would be some suggestion that someone else in the field had once thought of this idea, or that there might be some going on here, something of importance going on. And so that kind of a search can be made, and the computer will tell you within seconds where there are any papers, how many there are, where they are, and so forth. So that becomes a very, very important weapon for scientific research, which was developed by this company called ISI. Now, after I sold my publishing interest in 1980, this company became available. And it's a Philadelphia company, and it was for sale. And I arranged for some financing in New York and bought it. And it turned out to be one of the most exciting endeavors in the publishing world that I'd ever touched on. So to explain more what this company does, it subscribes to every journal of any consequence in the world. It'll leave out some second or third tier journals which aren't of importance. And all the journals come over to Limerick, Ireland. And just piles and piles of them come in every day. And there are 150 women, all Irish, most of them young, in their teens, who go through these journals, record every title, record every footnote, record every bibliographic reference, and often, if there's no abstract of the paper, they make an abstract. And amazingly, they're able to do it in many languages. They are able to do it in Russian, Chinese. Where the education and training came from, I don't know, but it's done in Ireland and done very effectively. So that all these journals are then indexed in that way. Then that information is transmitted to a computer in Philadelphia where it is stored. Now, that information digitally permits some very, very exciting research. the one example I just mentioned, to be able to find out if any crazy person in the world had ever had the same thought that you had of a connection between one disease and another. But another function of the company was you could take an existing paper that is, say, written 20 years ago and find out every paper that had cited it. So you could do research that way. If you could find a key paper on a certain subject, often your best research would be to do a citation count of every time that paper had been cited. And what you look for is a very basic, important paper. What do you call them in that type of paper? Anyway.
A seminal paper.
Seminal,
yeah.
right. And then do a citation count based on it, so that it becomes very valuable as a way of researching rather than plowing your way through a library and, hit or miss. How you spend hours and hours and hours in a library doing that kind of research. So that the computer made that kind of research possible. What it made possible was you could see or determine if people are reading these papers and where they've been cited. So that if a professor at Amherst had written a certain paper and he was, say, up for tenure, you could go to the computer and find out what his papers he'd written and when they've been cited, how often. And academic administrators often use that, or department heads use that, to determine whether the person's work was serious and whether other scientists viewed his or her work in a serious way. So it became a very valuable tool in evaluating the competence of a person or ability of a person or reputation of a person in some sort of a quantitative way. And so there were citation counts on people. For example, the most cited person in the world is Sigmund Freud.
Really?
And you can actually, we have a list somewhere of the 50 most cited people in history. And it's all there.
There you go.
And you can find out in 10 seconds, 2 seconds, who they are. Who is the guy at Harvard that's so controversial, or MIT who's so controversial? Anyway, he's number 2, I forget.
I see, okay, yeah.
Well, sometimes memories go. Anyway, the company became very valuable for that purpose. And for researching information and for also determining the qualifications or reputation of a scholar.
Yeah.
Now, one of the weaknesses of it is if your name is Smith, the computer cannot deal with that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you've got to be Dick Goldsby.
Yes.
And I don't know how many Dick Goldsby there are in genetics. Probably not many.
Not many.
That's manageable. But your name is important, so it's very important that when you're born, you choose a name that is searchable.
See. So you don't want to be a Smith or a Kim.
No, it's really tough, so that is absolutely critical. So that part is very, very, very valuable. Now, the flaw of the system is that people can rig their own citations because they can cite themselves.
Yes.
Or they get friends to cite themselves. And they can create an artificial track of citation use that isn't valid.
Yes.
The other criticism of it is that a lot of people will cite the paper as being wrong.
Oh.
And that's a negative citation.
Yes.
But the computer doesn't know that. The computer just says, Dick Goldsby was cited.
Yeah.
And people say, check,
Yes.
another point for Dick Goldsby. So that's a weakness in the system. But the argument is made, it's better to be cited negatively than not cited at all. So that's essentially the story of ISI. And that company, I didn't develop that company, but I had control of it for many years. And ultimately, we sold it to British interests.
Yes.
Regrettably, because it was certainly one of the most fascinating enterprises I was ever connected with.
They also developed the notion of impact factors of journals too, didn't they?
So yes, I should mention that. Journals are ranked according to academic quality. In any given field, there'll be, say, brain research. There might be 20 journals in the field. But librarians often want to know, well, should we stock them all? They're very expensive. I think brain research, maybe $20,000 a year. So they have to make a judgment. They want to know what are the best journals, what are the most reliable journals. And the question is, what are the ones that are most highly cited? And so ISI can tell you immediately the 5 most highly cited journals in any given field. And that becomes a very valuable thing, a resource for a librarian in determining what journals to stock in the library. Of course, it's now reaching the point where you won't have to have these library journals in print form at all. You can simply sit at your desk. Every journal will have a number, a barcode, in effect.
Yes.
And you just search that number, and the journal will appear on your PC immediately. The article will appear.
Yes.
So that is another very valuable, that is now coming fast, and will be a great blessing to libraries.
It's a revolution.
Because
yes.
you won't have to run to the library for the journal. You can simply sit and then punch out the request, and down it comes.
In the experimental sciences now, most of the journal reading is done via PDFs, electronically transmitted. You're absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people in the humanities want print. In other words, they want to give out print copies to friends. And I'm not sure that if you're doing research in Shakespeare, you might be using,
You might still
would you
want-
be using using this as a research tool as effectively? I don't know. Probably so. But it's genius in science.
Yeah, yeah,
It's genius in law research
yes.
and medical research. Very exciting.
Indispensable.
Yeah. So that's the story of ISI.
Yeah.